All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of the Children's Partnership, I'd like to take a moment to welcome everybody. Thanks for dedicating the next hour and a half of your evening to this very important conversation. We are, thrilled to have three presenters for you today, really hoping to deliver some good information about early childhood mental health, as well as offering some opportunities for advocacy and engaging on some important policy issues around young children and their mental health and well-being. So just really quickly, in case those of you who are joining us are new to the Children's Partnership, so the Children's Partnership is a California-based national children's advocacy organization committed to improving the lives of underserved children where they live, learn, and play, with breakthrough solutions at the intersection of research, policy, and community engagement. And I am Angela Vasquez, and I am the Mental Health Policy Director here at TCP. A bit of housekeeping, so next slide. Just so that everyone is aware, the webinar is being recorded. So the slides and the recording will be shared after the webinar. So we really hope that you are able to archive and keep this information once we send it out. Please answer the survey that will open at the end of this webinar. So once the webinar is done, a pop-up, your browser will pop up and there will be a brief survey. We just want to know what you've learned and that this was a useful webinar for your work. And with that, next slide. All right, so let's find out who is here tonight. So we have a couple of quick polls that we hope you will answer. So the first one is trying to get a sense of what role you play in early childhood. So we have some specifics, and then of course other, as we realize that this is not comprehensive. And if you choose other, it would be great if you could just pop into the chat sort of what your role is or why you're here. Give maybe 15 more seconds for folks to answer. Right, quite a bit of other. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to see. Here, I can share the results. So we have got quite a good spread. I'm so glad to see so many home visitors and childcare providers and even some clinicians with us today. So thank you very much. Like I said, keep populating the chat with who you are and why you're here. And with that, I will turn it over to our first presenter, Neva Wallach, who is the Bridge Training Coordinator at the Drew Child Care Corporation.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. If I could just get a thumbs up that you guys see my screen. Thank you so much. So good evening, everyone. I want to start by saying thank you so much for all the work that you do on behalf of our children, families, and community. It's really a pleasure to be here with you tonight, spending this time talking a little bit about what else we can do for our youngest Angelinos. So I will be giving us a brief overview of toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences. And I also want to say that Dr. Jessica Reinaga will be talking a little bit more about our program after, and there'll be the opportunity to learn more. You'll hear a little later on in the webinar. So before we can talk about toxic stress, before we can talk about adverse childhood experiences, it's really important for us to get a sense of what traumatic experiences we're seeing today. And so, you know, considering where we are with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing a lot of loss and sudden loss. We're also seeing a number of challenges related to refugee and war experiences, thinking about what our immigrant population is going through right now. So those are just two examples that I really wanted to pull, knowing that there are many other examples of traumatic experiences. But really, when we're thinking about our Black and Brown children, we know that there's a lot of disproportional impact on those communities specifically. And I invite you to keep that lens in mind as I go through the rest of my slides. So when we think about traumatic experiences, we know that there are two ways that these experiences are stored in our bodies. The first way being through our implicit memory, and the second way being through our explicit memory. So our implicit memories, they begin at birth. That's really like before we have the words to describe what might be going on or what may have happened. And, you know, when we think about trauma and we think about our bodies holding that, there's going to be a lot of experiences that we might not have words to describe. So that brings us to the second way that trauma experiences are stored, and that's through our explicit memory. So that's our conscious awareness. Basically, those are experiences that you can talk about. So again, our training series goes a lot more in depth, but I'm just going to keep this brief for us tonight. But what I really want to make sure we understand is a little tiny bit about the brain. So for us to understand how trauma impacts development, how trauma impacts the brain, I want you to know that there are three parts to the brain, the reptile brain being number one, and that's really where our survival instincts are coming from, that reflex reaction when something bad is going on, or when we have a threat or some sense of danger that's coming on. From there, the second part of the brain is the mammal brain, also known as the limbic brain, and that's where we store our feelings and emotions. The third part of the brain is the CEO brain, and that's our prefrontal cortex. That's where all of our language, all of our creativity, all of our critical thinking is stored. And so oftentimes for our little ones, for our children, they might be stuck in their reptile brain, which is going to make it really hard for them to regulate themselves. So a little bit more about how trauma can impact the brain. I wanted to give you a quick visual to kind of depict the differences between a typically developing brain for a 3-year-old on the left when compared to a highly traumatized child's brain at 3 years old that's on the right. And so as you can see, trauma can cause the brain to over or underdevelop in certain areas. And so it's not just about being able to hold these memories of trauma in our brain, but it's actually impacting our biology, the way that our cells are coming together. And so what this is going to look like for our young children is it might make it really hard for them to trust someone, and they may be going through life with so much fear and anxiety. And we're going to see that all of those early experiences related to trauma, they're gonna show up much later in life. And I'll talk about briefly what that looks like. But really wanting us to know that, you know, a common misconception that we've had for decades is that children don't remember what happens in their early years. And there's more and more research and science to really show that even if they don't have the words, even if they can't verbalize what happens, it is stored in the body through these different ways. So the other really big way that we can see that trauma impacts the body, and there are a lot of different ways, but I'm going to highlight the sensory system. And so due to trauma, that's going to impact the way a child views the world, the way their body listens to sounds, the way that their body reacts to different tastes. And more research is showing that there is that connection between trauma and how it impacts the sensory system. So as a result of trauma, we can actually see that sensory systems may stay in a state of high alert. You know, this might be the child that is really sensitive to loud sounds, or, you know, really is sensitive to bright lights. Those are some examples of how we can see this in our children. And this is a spectrum, like it's not an either or. So I want to hold that, like, trauma can be different for everyone. Next, I'm going to briefly share that the point that several different factors are going to impact how the trauma affects the child. So there's no like one size fits all for trauma. And one of the points I wanted to highlight here is there's the traumatic event, and then that child may face additional adversities after the traumatic event. So that's going to impact how severe the trauma was on the child. And so really encouraging us to hold that nuance in our mind of like trauma looks different, but it is very prevalent in our society. And the other point to kind of reinforce the differences amongst trauma experiences is that two children can go through the same traumatic event and have totally different reactions. So trying to dispel that myth that traumatized children look one way is going to really help us to create those secure attachments, to really help children heal from some of those early traumatic experiences. So holding the different impacts of trauma in mind and how it impacts the bodies, I want to show a more extreme example of how trauma can impact young children. And that is through toxic stress. So for us to be able to understand the impact of toxic stress, it's really important that we think about the different levels of the stress response. So there's basically 3 levels to the stress response system. The first one being positive, the second one being tolerable, and the third one being toxic. And so for the purpose of this presentation, I'm really only going to focus on toxic stress. And toxic stress is that prolonged activation of the stress response system, and it's in the absence of protective relationships. So what we know is that protective relationships can actually serve as a buffer against stress and create more resilience. So toxic stress can take place without those protective relationships that kind of help that child heal and transform out of the experiences that they've had. It can really be those secure attachments that help to create resilience. So talking a little bit about toxic stress in children, you know, the stress response system, it begins to develop while the mother is pregnant. So it actually starts in utero. And so our babies may be coming into the world with a high stress level, but even before they're born. And that's actually coded into their brain. And that coding, the way that the brain develops, is going to be based on their needs being met or ignored in those early stages of life. And each time a child signals for help, a part of the child's internal map continues to grow. And that kind of speaks to, you know, being able to develop those secure attachments. That's really going to help our children heal. So when we think about toxic stress, we want to make sure to pay attention to the child's needs, and trauma-informed care is going to offer us some tools to do that. Let me get a little bit more concrete here. So these are some potential signs of stress in infants and toddlers. I like to pull out the first one here: yawning, drooling, hiccuping. On their own, they may seem, like just something normal that happens, but with our trauma lens, we can begin to pay attention to these cues from our youngest children and recognize them as potential early signs of stress. So because, our infants and toddlers may not have the words to be able to describe the trauma, these are some of the cues we want to begin to recognize to help us be better caregivers. You can see the last one here too. It talks about some of those sensory cues that I mentioned earlier. So all of these, so toxic stress and all the topics I've talked about so far really are further reinforced by the research that came about from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And so I'm sure that a lot of us are already familiar with this research, but one statistic that I did want to pull is that it really helped to highlight that about 67% of us have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. And in people of color, it's more likely to be closer to 83%. And that just gives us like a frame, a ballpark estimate to really understand how prevalent early trauma can be in our society. And I think just taking a moment to really sit with that and think about the widespread impact of trauma, it really reinforces the need for us to have these prevention programs and to start as soon as we can on intervening with our children. So the ACEs study, basically, it came out of San Diego, California, around 1998. I'm sure we're familiar, but it identified these 10 original adverse childhood experiences and created a link between this and obesity. So it was kind of an accidental finding, and basically it's important to note that as a result of this research on about 17,000 participants, that there were three main categories for the ACEs. The first one being abuse, you can see on the left, the second one being neglect, and the third one being household dysfunction. And because of this really essential research, it's helped us to better understand, childhood trauma and then be able to intervene. So I want to note that the original participants, they had some privilege. Overwhelmingly, they were white, Caucasian, they had health insurance. There were a number of other factors that kind of play into the results of this research study. And further research has come afterwards to really highlight the holes in this study, but also spread even more awareness of what may be contributing to adverse childhood experiences. So that really led to some extended ACEs. And just like I was talking about earlier, the prevalence of discrimination and racism, as well as community violence, is disproportionately impacting our communities of color. And so knowing that, this large group of the original ACEs study, they already identified so many different childhood traumas, that then to hear later on that there's additional community impacts that are contributing, it really paints the picture of what our communities of color are facing today. So like I said, when you pair those adverse childhood experiences with these larger community experiences, it is creating a right ground for resilience in the support of protective relationships. So it really speaks to the impact of everyone on this call's work to be able to shift the trajectory of our children, given the adverse childhood experiences that we now know are so common in our society. One last kind of point I want to make about ACEs is that what we know now as a result of this research is that it can have a negative impact throughout the lifespan. And so you can see here that starting with adverse childhood experiences, it can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, the adoption of health risk behaviors, disease, disability, and social problems, ultimately leading to early death. And so we really want all of us to understand the importance of knowing about childhood trauma so that we can respond in ways to really make a difference in the lives of our children. And so it wouldn't be an ACEs presentation if I didn't quickly talk about resilience and just highlight how important it is for everyone in this virtual space together to do their best to support a child. And so the number one support for a child is you, and you can make the difference in creating safety, consistency, and nurturing those relationships with the children in your community. So here are some references, and I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. And I'm going to be turning it back over to Angela.
Great, thank you, Neva. With that, we will move to our second presenter. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Jessica Reinaga, who is the Associate Director of the Trauma Informed Care Bridge Program at the Drew Child Development Corporation.
Thank you so much, Angela. Let me make sure this is going to be shown correctly. Oh, can you guys see my slides? We just tested it. There they are. Okay. I want to thank Neva. Neva, you did such a great job. Thank you for all of that important information. I'm really going to build off of that. I think it's a perfect introduction because what we just learned about is that children do have mental health, right? And that there are challenges that can happen and behaviors that can be impaired as a result of that, but there's things that we can do. And so what I want to share with you is a little bit about our program, the Emergency Child Care Bridge for Foster Children program. It's actually statewide, but we're going to talk about what we're doing here in LA County. So I'll get into it. Kind of to add to everything that Neva just shared, our program is specifically for what kind of came about as a result of the needs of foster care children in California. So I want to give you guys a little bit of information about that experience and some of the challenges that foster children face in California, so then you can see why the Bridge program was born. So in 2018, California, excuse me, there are about 60,000 children and youth who are living in the foster care system. And the children 0 to 5 are the largest group that's entering the foster care system for the first time. And this might not be new information for many of us, but it's still really important that we look at these statistics. Okay, so more foster care stats. 50% of children in foster care experience 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So exactly what Neva was just sharing with us, right? We know, and she was talking about compounded traumas, right? Compounded adverse experiences. And that the more traumas that you experience, the more likely it is that you're going to have negative health outcomes and kind of overall life outcomes, which we'll look at a little bit in a few seconds. So the fact that 50% of our foster care children have 4 or more, that already tells us that they are a high-risk population and have needs that we should be attending to. So some more information, children in foster care are 3 to 6 times more likely to have a mental health need. they're 40 to 60%. 40 to 60% of them are entering foster care under the age of 6 and already have a developmental delay. And 33% have a chronic health condition. So again, really tying in the fact that there is a connection between traumatic experiences, adverse childhood experiences, and negative health outcomes. So in case some of us are here in the early childhood education field, you might be familiar with the fact that expulsions in the ECE field are kind of a big deal. Preschool children are 3 times more likely to be expelled than children in grades K through 12, which when the first time I heard that stat, excuse me, several years ago, I was like, what? That's crazy to me. How is that possible that our little ones are getting expelled that quickly or that much at that frequency? And then when we looked at children in traditional childcare settings, so maybe not preschool, but like our family care centers, things like that, are nearly 6 times more likely to be expelled than children in grades K through 12. So it gets even higher. The data gets a little bit rougher, and it's the metric that we're getting better at tracking, but from what we're seeing, it is a problem. And so we know that there are long-term effects of expulsions and suspensions. And this is probably something that some of you might be familiar with. It's really called the school to prison pipeline. Again, a concept that I was very familiar with. And then once I started doing more ECE work, I realized, wow, this is really the preschool to prison pipeline, right? The early childhood center school to prison pipeline. And so when that happens, what we know is that when children get expelled or suspended, they're more likely, 10 times more likely to drop out of high school, experience an academic failure, hold negative school attitudes, or face incarceration. So these are not outcomes that we want our young ones, our little ones to be facing. And so as a result of that, California Senate was really smart, and they said, hey, you know what? These foster care children need support, and these child care providers need additional support that are working with children that are 0 to 5 in foster care. If they're in foster care 0 to 5, they're not in school. So if families are working, they still need to go to some kind of child care. That can be challenging. So Senate Bill 89 was passed, which is our program. And there are 3 components to the program. A voucher that is a time-limited voucher that allows families who have just received placement of a foster child to immediately go and find childcare for this new child that's staying with them, right? So I'm a new resource parent. I have a foster child that's 0 to 5. I'm working and I need to find care for this child. Now there's a voucher that's going to help me pay for that care, and a navigator that's going to help me find the right placement that fits my family's needs. And then once the child is placed, the other component of the program, which I'm going to continue to highlight now, is the trauma-informed care aspect. So really knowing that if we know that there's a higher prevalence of children with trauma in our foster care system, and this program is intentionally bundling those children and creating more of a way for them to access affordable childcare, well, then our childcare provider field needs to be prepared to support these children, right? Because we know from what Neva was sharing earlier is that when children experience trauma, all of the symptoms that can manifest really present as dysregulated behaviors. And those dysregulated behaviors are challenging, right? Can be challenging to manage. So what is trauma-informed care? This is like a high-level kind of picture. I'm not going to read all of the words to you, but essentially, trauma-informed care is really aiming to recognize the widespread impact of trauma, right? So as was mentioned, there's a high prevalence of children in our country, unfortunately, that have experienced trauma. One stat that was from a couple years back is something about 70% of children have experienced at least one violent act, and that could be abuse, neglect, physical abuse. That violent act is only one type of trauma, right? Because as was also pointed out, children can be displaced from their homes because of natural disaster. There could be immigration issues going on. So there's a whole host of experiences. It doesn't have to be physical abuse or neglect for a child to experience something as traumatic. And so trauma-informed care is really wanting all of the service providing professionals to be aware of that reality. And so then to respond or to recognize that, right? We're realizing that it's prevalent. So we want to recognize what that looks like in those that we work with. So understanding, what do these behaviors say? What are trauma behaviors, or what could possibly be trauma behaviors? And what is normal development? Sometimes that's really hard to decipher between, but that's why the more information and education we have, the better we can be attuned to the needs of our children. So we recognized it, trauma, we realize it, we recognize it, and then we respond to it, right? We know, we have an idea, we know what's going on, and now we know how to respond to this. So what are some trauma-informed strategies that I can use with the children in my care? That's what our program is really teaching childcare providers to do. And all of this is for the purpose of resisting re-traumatization. So because trauma can present so differently, and because it really impacts for children how they experience the world, their sensory experiences, we don't know what could be triggering for a child. And so if we don't have our trauma-informed lens on, we could be doing things that are mistakenly, right, not intentionally, re-traumatizing that child. We don't want to do that, because that just further reinforces the trauma. And what we want to do is really build that secure attachment where the child is less fearful, more trusting, right? So this is the goal. These are the goals of trauma-informed care across all fields, and specifically how we use them for ECE. Okay, so what do we do? What does the Bridge program offer? We offer, in addition to the voucher and the navigation, the trauma-informed care services side is that we offer an 8-module series to any childcare provider. All childcare providers in LA County, it's free. It's 2 hours. Right now it's virtual. Before the pandemic, it was live. Some of the trainings can be a little bit longer, but most of them are 2 hours in length. We offer them virtually, and again, for everyone. And when we say childcare provider, we mean from the FCC to license exams, to center-based staff, to preschools even, right? So we mean the whole gamut. If you're working with little ones, especially 0 to 5, then this is a free resource for you. We also offer individual coaching for childcare providers that are actively serving a Bridge child or a child through the Bridge program. So we need to be able to, we want to really not only inform the field and support the field with that kind of first level training, but we also want to be able to work individually with the provider to make sure that they have the resources that they need to really start changing their skill set. And the way that before I go there, so why is it important? If we haven't told you already on why it's important, some of the big reasons are that mental health for children does exist, right? They are impacted, as Neva shared, it gets stored in the body. And I've done some research on this topic, and we know that there's a common misconception across the childcare provider field, but also just anyone really working with children, so including parents, that children are immune to trauma. That was a popular belief, right? That they're too young, they don't remember it. And even though they can't explicitly say, some of them are too young, they don't have the language, we know, like what Neva was sharing, that it is stored in the body, and you will see it through some of these dysregulated behaviors, which are ways that the children appear to be acting out, right? And so it's really important for us to address this kind of misconception, because what we see happening is that well-meaning childcare providers, teachers, anyone that's parents, right, will see a child's behavior and read that as bad. This child is bad, they're spoiled, they, just kind of like negative, it's an intentional thing. And so if the child is willfully doing this, that impacts our motivation to work with the child in an empathetic way. And it's one of the things that leads to these expulsions, right, and suspensions, because there's also this idea that I can't do anything to change it. This is how that child is. It's kind of beyond my help. But what we know with trauma-informed care is that it's not. There are strategies that we can all utilize. You don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic, is what I love to say. There are strategies that we can all utilize that will help build resilience in our children and really solidify those attachments and turn them from maybe not the strongest to really secure attachments that are going to set these children up for success later on and mitigate some of the original trauma that they've experienced. So they're hard, traumatic experiences or cause dysregulated child behavior. Those are hard to manage. We want to give these strategies to help manage that so that they don't get expelled. And there's strategies for all children in your care. So that's the other biggest thing is at this age, they're so small that children get dysregulated for a number of things. That was also mentioned. It's part of normal development. So the strategies that are covered in our training series and in many training series on trauma-informed strategies, they're really applicable for all of them. So that kid that is dysregulated, flipping their lid, throwing a tantrum because their toy was taken, and that's it, these strategies will work for that child in the same way that they'll work for the child who maybe is coming in from the foster care system and has a little bit more high needs. Okay, so if you're interested in LA County, how are we implementing this program? It's really through a large collaborative effort that's coordinated by the Child Care Alliance and also DCFS. And so we partner through Child Development, partners with the Child Care Alliance and all of the partner agencies underneath, which you see down below. It's a wonderful, wonderful network of 8 different resource and referral, childcare resource and referral agencies in LA County. If you're familiar with the R&R network, it's actually statewide, and we're very blessed in LA County to have 8 that we can work with. And so there are trauma-informed care trainers and coaches at all of these 8 agencies, as well as navigators that will help you, if you're a resource parent, utilize that voucher and find appropriate childcare. Some of our coaching and training topics, we really kind of give an introduction to what is trauma-informed care, right? We talk about observation of a child, shadowing of provider skills, and in the environment. We promote strategies to support parent relationships with the child. So if any of you are familiar with strengthening families, that's very much a part of this model as well. We know that one of the #1 predictors of a child's mental health is a parent's mental health, and families need support too. So that's a big part that we want to help providers understand, that you're not just working with the child, you're kind of working with the whole family. So how can we do that? Strategies to build a safe and welcoming environment, a cozy corner, that getting those sensory opportunities for children, right? Strategies to soothe a child exhibiting dysregulated behaviors. I'm not going to read all of them. I think we'll probably make the slides available to you, but there's tons of strategies that we go over. And similarly, these are the different training topics that we have, the different modules. Right now, our modules have just been revised. So we have 7 that we're actively offering. We have 2 new ones that are going to be coming out in the next fiscal year. So probably in the summer months, they'll be ready for you all to start, partaking in that, which are historical trauma, because we do understand that it's really important to be able to have, like Neva said, address the disproportional experiences of our communities of color, and that paints a part of who all of the children are, and that really informs all of the strategies that need to be implemented as well. This is a little bit of our impact in case you're wondering. So in LA County, since the program has begun, we've enrolled over 3,800 children to the Bridge program, so able to place them with childcare providers. And we've trained over 3,000 childcare providers. And we just recently did a follow-up survey, hot off the press. These are just some key takeaways from the providers that were able to respond. There were providers, 168, that completed the entire training series. And so months after they completed their training, 98% reported feeling more prepared to work with children who've experienced trauma as a result of completing the training series. 89 report that they shared this information with others, and 100% said that they would recommend it. So that's great for us. Hopefully that shows it's a worthwhile resource. It's a free resource. So I just really want to share our program. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. I think this is an incredible program, and we'll talk a little bit more at the end of this how folks at the state level are looking to increase access to your amazing program. And I think I also wanted to uplift the data you showed around preschool and childcare suspensions and expulsions. And that data, when you dive even deeper and you look at the racial disparities, it's particularly acute for Black children. And so we at the Children's Partnership feel like that is a really telling data point, given what Neva shared about how adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress are disproportionately impacting young Black children as well. So thank you so much for sharing this incredible program, because you are arming us with information to support our youngest children. And so with that, I will turn it over to our final presenter, Kim Gall, who is the president and CEO of First 5 Orange County.
Terrific. I'm going to get my slides up here. I could get a thumbs up that you all can see them. All right, perfect. So again, I'm Kim Gall. I'm with First 5 Orange County, and I am so excited to be here and present a little bit of the work that we're doing in Orange County. And I want to thank my co-presenters. I know every time I learn and listen to presentations on toxic stress and just the effect on our kiddos, I take away something else and I learn a little bit deeper, and it's impactful for me. So hopefully that's the experience for all of you. So in First 5, the way that is my slide advanced for the next slide? Can I get a thumbs up? No. Okay. Did it advance now? Okay. So our vision, or I should start with, if you know First 5s, they exist in every county. Our sole purpose is to invest in things that improve the health and educational outcomes for young children. We focus extensively prenatally through the age of 5. But there is a lot of local control for each First 5. So with that word, we have a fair degree of discretion about how do we apply our funding to our local context. So for us, our vision is ensuring that all children reach their full potential. What we're committed to and what we focus on are conditions that keep problems in place, if you will, and how can we affect those conditions. So the first condition is ensuring that children get early and ongoing health and development support, that they grow up in safe and stable and nurturing homes, that our neighborhoods support young children and their families, and that there's an equitable distribution of resources. When we think about all resources, not just First 5's resources, but those are the ones that we can control. But then how do we advocate around the equitable distribution of resources? We use 4 strategies to kind of tackle those conditions. The first one, which we've talked a little bit about today, is really getting involved early. I always use the phrase, I try and create a sense of urgency when I'm talking about our work. So I use the phrase that babies don't wait, right? That brain is growing, and it's growing so rapidly, and we all can't wait for the systems to catch up with the knowledge building activities that we have. This is the time to act. I spoke a little bit about it, but elevating equity, really figuring out a way that we can incorporate parent voice in everything we do, that we're really understanding the issues of disparity, and that we're taking accountability and responsibility for disrupting that. We also then do a lot of work around supporting our communities so that there are enough champions to elevate and hold systems accountable to the work that we want to see and that we know improve outcomes for young children. So that's champions at a family and community level, all the way up to the folks that are making our public policy decisions. And lastly is the alignment of systems, right? We have these big organizations or bureaucracy that come in and out of the lives of our families. And what First 5 holds ourselves accountable to is rising information up to these bureaucracies and really working both in partnership with them, but also as an additive element to the system, sort of a disruptive element that's reminding folks about the importance of those first 5 years. Again, babies can't wait, and that we have a lot of knowledge that we're not fully utilizing in every setting to improve our outcomes. So again, that prevention, early intervention strategy. So switching gears now from sort of who we are in the context in which we work in Orange County, I want to talk a little bit more about our own sort of a trajectory and learning and becoming even more aware about the early childhood mental health needs, and what we could do to impact those. And I want to be careful that I don't make it sound like we weren't aware of early childhood mental health before 2014. We absolutely were, and we consistently have invested in things like home visitation. But I think where the awakening occurred from us is really this connection between early care and education settings and the opportunity that existed there and what they were telling us about early childhood mental health. And we needed to stop, pause, and listen. So as indicated on the slide, around 2014, 2015, we started to hear pretty consistently stories of early child care educators having experiences with really disruptive behavior in the classroom and being put into positions like expelling a student or trying to work with parents, but not really having the resources in order to work with parents the way they might want to. Around that same time, we had a collaborative of folks that were deeply passionate about early childhood mental health coming together to draw more attention to this issue. And then lastly, as we were starting to hear about this, we reflected on our own data. First Five Orange County has a reputation of being very steeped in data and rich in data. We're the only county in the United States that has a comprehensive kindergarten readiness assessment. We use the Early Developmental Index. We have 100% participation in our public kindergarten classrooms. So we looked at that and said, what can that data tell us to help inform what we do as next steps? And so more to come on that. But so we both looked externally and internally and tried to use the data to help us drive what we did next. So taking a step back and exploring that data, you heard in the earlier presentations, the national data that reflects that expulsion rates for preschoolers. What we wanted to do is say, what does it look like in Orange County? So the data in this slide really represents what we found out in Orange County. And so it mirrored pretty closely what we were learning about from a national perspective, where you have a fourth of early care and educational providers have behavior or mental health concerns about kids in their actual program. Having to ask parents to remove their child from their program because of those concerns. And then also accepting in kids that had challenging behaviors and they knew that that child had challenging behaviors and the sort of uneasiness that happened. So this was survey related data. We took that survey related data. And this data is fairly consistent. So you have family child care providers feeling and center-based experiencing these things, and then license exempt providers. And lastly, what we looked at is 2003 data along with 2015 data, and you saw this trend upward for the struggles of providers, right? What we were experiencing in 2003 to what was being experienced in 2015, the trend was heading in the wrong direction, and we could identify that there weren't really comprehensive resources for our childcare providers. So we did some focus groups, and as you can see, what we learned about the childcare providers is that oftentimes they wanted to do something, but they didn't feel confident enough, if you will, or able to access the right resources. Also, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but childcare providers are stretched incredibly thin. What we ask them to do in the hours of work, a lot of times that's around the clock work or extended hours. So to ask them to add additional training outside of their programs didn't seem like a really sustainable or viable option for us. So definitely knew that a coaching model or something that can be happening in real time and learning in complement to some additional trainings, but really emphasizing their time constraints. And then what we did is we finished this research with asking parents about what they experienced. And again, I'm just echoing some of the stuff that you've already heard on the previous presentations, but parents really acknowledged a lack of awareness or true understanding of developmentally appropriate behavior. And a lot of times they might be witnessing their own child's behavior, but they never see that necessarily in a consistent and comprehensive way mapped against other children's behavior. So to expect them to understand quote unquote normal or typical development trajectories is maybe we needed to do a better job of outreach to parents and ensuring and continuing to work on those efforts. Also, though, and again, I think there was some discussion about this in the earlier presentations, I think we needed to look and understand the opportunity that existed to deepen and leverage the relationship that is experienced between parents and child care providers, right? That's a trusted resource for that parent. And how could we better use that relationship when we thought about early childhood mental health? And then again, I know that this is well known, but the continued and ongoing struggles about stigma around identifying a child as having a challenging behavior or some mental health concerns so young in their life really resonated with our parents. And so having to try and deal with that issue when we thought about what we would do as next steps. And then obviously we all know about sort of financial issues with families, if it was a fee-based service and or any sort of needing a diagnosis or health qualifications, and that's not likely to happen at the ages that we are talking about. And then real life barriers like transportation to an additional program or trying to do something in addition to what the families was already able to navigate. So we had our survey data that I first talked about, our focus group data with our providers, focus group data with our parents, and then what we layered on top of this is our early developmental index. So the map that's on the screen is actually from 2019 because we refresh it all the time. But when we were doing this work, it was really 2016 data that we were using. But it doesn't make a difference, but I just want to highlight that. So I'm being transparent. So what you see on this data is the early developmental index looks at kindergarten readiness across 5 developmental domains. And so what we did is we created a social emotional composite out of all of that assessment. So we took all of those questions and responses that are linked to social emotional health and created a composite. And what you see in the really deep orange segments of the map is areas where 13 to 30% of the kids are vulnerable, meaning they are, when you just look at their social and emotional health, they are not ready to start kindergarten. They are vulnerable for a lack of success at kindergarten based on their social emotional readiness. And then when you look at the hot pink areas on the map, this is where 1 in 5 children are vulnerable. So this helped to inform our work in terms of where we might want to target. It also helped to bring even more of a local context to our work and really help us understand sort of the geographic spread, the intensities of the issues that we were seeing. So all that now pivoting to, so what did you do about it? So we chose to invest in a mental health consultation for early care and education program. So very similar to what's happening in some of these other settings where our whole goal is to reduce preschool suspension and expulsion, but we do that through increasing early educators' capacity to support a children's mental health, increase the early identification of adverse childhood experiences, and probably most important to the overall success is really connecting parents and providers with additional resources so that there is this normalizing of additional resources that might be needed for families and where they could get them that are really appropriate for that family. They're localized within that community. They are no cost or low cost so that it comes from a much more connected place for that family. It's not a referral to somewhere outside of the community or needing additional connections. It's a warm handoff. So this program, we funded the pilot, but the good news here and kind of linking back to the context that I was setting about the way in which we go about our work is we used all of this data that we had harvested and analyzed to present to our Mental Health Services Act board and kind of raise the awareness using the early developmental maps and using what we knew and the pilot results from this. And I'm happy to acknowledge that this is now funded annually at roughly $2 million. So it's free to providers. We currently have capacity. So if there's anybody out on the webinar that is an Orange County provider, you can email that email address and ask for this service. So that's been one of our primary strategies. One is to be the agent, if you will, of innovation and trying to create the backbone of funding to get us to an acknowledgement that this problem exists, and then to hold those other agents of scale and sustainability accountable for creating this resource in the community in a much more sustainable way than what First Five could offer. Our work around early childhood mental health doesn't stop just with that consultation program. Obviously, our interest was piqued when we learned all about the struggles of our ECE community. And so we dove even deeper than what some of the programs that we were already doing. And about 3 years ago, we wrote and received a Pritzker Fellowship to really dive in deep around perinatal mood and anxiety disorder, right? Again, there was some discussion about this earlier in the presentation, that we know a child's mental health is linked to that overall family function and mom and dad's mental health. So the more that we could do to stabilize mental health for families, the better off we would be. So we invested in this a toolkit, also watching state legislation over the last couple of years. You've seen our legislature pass a couple of bills that required this screening for postpartum depression for moms. And we wanted to make sure that those providers were then connected to community resources as well, First Five funded resources and others. So we created a toolkit for providers that link them to community resources for families. I mentioned earlier that we have ongoing relationships with our public schools that have a kindergarten population. We fund work within each of those public schools. And what we do is we use our early developmental index data to help raise their awareness and get them on point around social emotional, so that they're not only thinking about those traditional kindergarten readiness skills, but they're really thinking about things like pro-social behavior, so regulatory behavior for kids. What else could they be doing to smooth that transition from preschool programs into school district programs? It's particular to those local needs that are identified in the early developmental index. We are all in on any mental health countywide collaborative. Those of us that work sort of with other agencies always know we spend so much time putting out fires, but not preventing the fires. So my staff and the team of consultants that we work with show up at all of these meetings trying to highlight for folks the opportunity for investment in early childhood and never allowing that conversation to die, making sure that folks understand that there is mental health in early childhood. It is a thing, and it is a thing we can invest in, and it would improve our outcomes later in life if we did this. And again, we credit like that, those kinds of conversations with the ongoing funding that consultation program received, right? It's kind of continuing to hold folks accountable to the data that we see. We're a Help Me Grow county, so we integrated the Pearls tool into our developmental screening registry. So now there is a place for that to be reservoired. We're working with our school districts to get better access and data sharing so that they can be aware of what screenings, both behaviorally and developmentally, their little ones coming into their programs have had, to kind of, again, put the family at the center so that they don't have to be the sole responsible entity to communicate everything that child is experiencing or where they're at. We're an unfunded partner in the ACEs Aware grants. We serve as sort of a coordinating and a convener, trying to reduce duplication and increase coordination and leveraging of existing community resources. And then lastly, we're going to be all in. It's a new pivot to our work and a deepening understanding of the connection between mental health and substance use disorder, working with our child protective services, trying to think about how we can bring a deepening understanding of mental health to that work and family preservation and protective factors. Excited about that. And then before I close, I just want to offer, I talked a little bit about elevating equity as a priority for our First Five, and the data that I shared earlier around social emotional composite. What we did is we looked at this through a race lens, and we identified this tool that we use is called the disparity index for the early developmental index, and it's used to help us show the gaps so that we can then effectively make sure that when we're distributing resources, we're doing it in an appropriate way. We're distributing our own resources more equitably to the communities that need it. So what that looks like when you actually look at our data using our early developmental index data, is that Black and Latino kindergartners in Orange County are 42 and 40% more likely to be vulnerable when we look at social emotional indicators on the developmental index. So just orienting you on the slide, things to the left are, if you will, better, less vulnerable. Things on the left are more likely to be vulnerable in that. So it's just a different way to look at the data. It's rather than comparing one group to the average, like as if the average is where we want people to be, this helps us compare and isolate groups against how the rest of the group is performing. So it helps drive the system to accelerate performance versus just mediocre. So we're really excited about our ability to look at the data in this way and continue to target our resources to those that need us most and not just everyone, if you will. So with that, I'm excited to answer any questions that folks might have. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kim. We will get to questions in a moment, but first wanted to highlight some upcoming advocacy opportunities. So you've heard today from all three of our presenters, young kids, young children have mental health, they have social emotional needs. And those needs really are met by their environment and the relationships with you all, with adults, caregiving, caretaking adults in their lives. And so what you've heard today also are various, I think, really important critical models to supporting you all in the work that you do with young kids. But we know, of course, like many things, we as a state simply just don't currently dedicate the resources that are necessary for this type of work so that every child has what they need to develop healthy and socially, emotionally well. And particularly, we know that those disparities play out in a racial context. So the first opportunity to address this at a statewide level is the prevention and early intervention regulations change happening. So really what I want you to take away is that these regulations are around a key source of mental health funding, and they're being rewritten right now. This Prevention and Early Intervention Fund funds a variety of services, both direct services as well as really capacity building and innovative practices to prevent and intervene early for folks who may experience mental health challenges later down the road. And so this is truly a huge opportunity to ensure that young children are incorporated in the Prevention and Early Intervention Fund regulations. We want to make sure that these regulations call out specifically the needs of young children for early childhood mental health services. And what those look like are really services that support your relationships with young children, support adult caregiving relationships, so that when you do have a child who has experienced trauma or who has experienced an adverse childhood experience, that you have the skills and the tools necessary to support that child's resilience. And so again, you'll get these links both in an email, and my colleague Araceli will drop them in the chat, but we really encourage you all to register and attend one of the upcoming regional listening sessions. So 2 have already taken place in the Northern and Bay Area regions that you see here, but there is still opportunity for Southern California, Los Angeles, and Central California early childhood professionals. If you work with or on behalf of young children, then we very much encourage you to go to one of these sessions and really just talk about the needs that you are seeing in young children. So if we go to the next slide. And then you'll get these again in an email, but here are some talking points that we want to make sure that the Mental Health Commission, who is going to be rewriting these regulations, this is the message we really want to be able to deliver, that young children have specific social emotional development needs. So cite this presentation, cite what you learned here today, print it out and have it in front of you. You know, we want to tell them that we have to invest in services that prevent these long-term consequences, that, you know, the various data points that you saw here, that one third of young children already have at least one adverse childhood experience, and that racial and ethnic disparities in social determinants of mental health like poverty and racialized violence compound these stressors. So, and you heard that from our presenter Neva. We can't wait for young children to grow up and develop mental and behavioral health challenges in order to intervene, right? This is the Prevention and Early Intervention Fund. We need to be funding upstream interventions, the work that you all are doing in the first 5 years of a young child's life. And that we want the commission to invest in strategies that build up protective factors for young children, like relationships with caring adults and positive social emotional development. All right, and then the second opportunity, yes, next slide, thank you. The second opportunity is that, so you heard about this great training that Jessica is providing to childcare providers who have who take under their care a foster child. And what we have learned, and what I've learned in talking with Jessica, is that, and you probably already intuitively know this, there's just not enough resources, both childcare resources and the training and support resources needed to meet the demand. So we are not even sort of serving every young foster child with these kinds of services. And what you all probably already know, but what we need to express to the legislature is that every child needs this kind of support. Every child, particularly children from marginalized communities, need this kind of support in the form of supporting the adults who are taking care of them. And so one way we'd like the legislator to start down that path is by expanding this emergency child care bridge program. And so you'll see here some specific items, but really, if you want to get involved in this effort, you can contact myself, Angela Vasquez, and you'll have my email address, or you can contact Susanna Niffen, and her email address is there as well. Okay, and so now we can move into questions. I've been taking notes and seeing folks populate the chat with some questions, and so over the next 19 minutes, we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So the first one, let's start with this one right here. This is probably a question for Kim. So when collecting data about expulsions, do you include those situations when children or families are, quote, asked to leave the early learning program?
Yes, in the data that I referenced that was localized to Orange County, we did include when a provider asked a parent to leave and a parent chose to leave that program as an expulsion.
Got it. This is probably a question for everyone, but maybe Jessica. So when explaining ACEs and trauma to providers, what are the misperceptions that they have? Are there any patterns? And then the same question about parents. So maybe first, do providers have misperceptions about ACEs and trauma?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we were also able to do a focus group with some of our providers that had completed the entire series a couple months back. And one of the biggest things was, again, this belief that trauma doesn't even impact. It's for not even that they believe it doesn't, but there's not even an awareness. right? So it's not even on the radar that it could be something that's impacting. And then there's also a belief that it doesn't because the children are too young to remember. Some other kind of misconceptions, we talked a lot about their attributions. What did they attribute the behaviors to without having kind of the full information? And a lot of that, some of that was, again, that this was like a negative child disposition. So if the child is bad and that the child is just kind of beyond help too, there's nothing that they can do. So that's a common misperception. That's that childcare providers see the behavior, hear that there could be a history of trauma, and then will want to refer to the regional center as a first step, as opposed to kind of implementing some trauma-informed strategies first, which are really about building that relationship and trying to implement some lower level strategies, which might be appropriate before referring. So there's that, excuse me, of course, I've been fine all day. And the minute we get on the webinar, something's in my throat. The other thing that kind of came up as a belief was that if there was a child that was showing dysregulated behavior, it was actually because the parents were not doing a good job parenting. So there was judgment towards parents, which then again builds or takes away from having this empathetic, let's work together mentality, which is what we want to promote, that the childcare provider, the caregiver are a team working with this child, right? But if I'm walking around with this belief that, well, you spoil your child and that's why they act like that, or you don't have any discipline in the home and that's why they're acting like that, I might have a different motivation, right? That might change my motivation to working with you. So those are some of the things that popped up that we know that providers are trying to work past. And a lot of providers have, and all of us have kind of grown up in our own cultures with beliefs about how to raise children and what children understand and what they don't understand. So I think for many of the providers, our first few trainings on just how does trauma impact development and really going through a little bit more intentionally the impact of trauma on the brain is a big eye opener for providers, because that's something that they're also like, well, I had no idea. I hope that answers the question. Those are some of them.
Yes. Did you notice any specific or different misperceptions with parents and the parents that have been educated about this?
We don't work directly with parents. Our primary, we have some caregivers that attend the training, but primarily it's providers. So the focus group that we did was with providers. But many of the providers are parents, right? Many of them are family home givers. So I would say it's pretty similar, but we don't have like data on that. Although there is literature saying that these are just common misconceptions, and not just providers, parents, but teachers, like of all ages, have these beliefs around child behaviors and misunderstandings about how those behaviors can actually be a result of trauma.
Got it. So really for all three of our presenters, do you have any resource recommendations that would be useful for childcare providers and educators? So a list of best practices that you can be using, or maybe more of the list that Neva shared about dysregulating signs. Do you have a list of resources?
Neve, do you want to go take this one?
Sorry, I'm like unmuting. I was on the double mute. Thank you for that question. I want to say, like, we have tons of resources, and I want to really encourage you to join us for one of our trainings. But we can definitely like look into maybe sending something out as a follow-up of some concrete resources for this. Jess, is there any specific one that's coming to mind for you?
Well, I mean, it's really hard because there are so many resources that it's hard to point you to like just one. But a good resource is Sesame Street and Communities. So that is a great website. Just in general, I mean, it's not like specifically trauma informed, but the way they're approaching child mental health and infant mental health is. And there are a ton of videos that are all free for anybody who wants to. So it's Sesame Street in communities. And you can say, are you a parent? Are you a caregiver? It has it in English and Spanish, possibly other languages as well. And there are well, not a million, that's an exaggeration, but there are a ton of different topics that you can choose from grief and loss, to divorce, to, you know, any kind of traumatic experience. And you can get short stories, handouts, videos. So how do you talk to kids about it? You can show the kids these videos. So that's a great, like if you're just kind of looking and want to look for different resources that you can use right away, that's a good one. But we can also see if what we can send that might be succinct that Angela can pass along to everyone on this webinar.
Great, thank you. And I think one of your colleagues also posted the website for where to register for these trainings. And so, like I said, we'll make sure to have everything compiled and send out to everybody so that you have all the links and resources in one place. I'm also actually curious, Jessica or Neva, if either of you can talk about the reflective practice component, because what I feel like is really important about your program is not just that it's a training, right? Because you can film a training and you can give trainings virtually. And I think that's very foundational to supporting early childhood professionals. But there's this additional component that maybe you can share a bit about what it is and why it's so critical to your approach.
Who wants to go first? Do you want me to take this first, Neve? Okay. Yeah, so reflective practice really is something that was born out of the childcare community because this work is so hard, right? This work can be difficult. We know that raising children is hard. And again, like we've been naming, there are a lot of emotions, attitudes, attributions, like things that are impacting us all the time, that then those beliefs, whether they're true or not, impact the way that we work with the child, right? So it's important to be able to pause and reflect on whatever you're feeling in that moment, or not in that moment, but after the fact. And so reflective practice is this intentional practice of with another person, with another colleague, ideally, but really you can do it with anyone, right? We use it with our coaches and the providers. They can do it at home. With their partners as they're processing the day, but it's this really intentional practice of really mirroring yourself through somebody else. So sharing what that felt like and why this one parent is triggering you so much, right? This one parent is really irritating you. You don't really have your thumb on like why exactly, but through reflection and kind of reflective questioning and processing, usually it reveals itself, right? And so we can then, usually there's some kind of misconception or misunderstanding, or there's a place where we can say, okay, now that you have deeper insight into what that family is going through, does that change the way you want to approach them? And oftentimes what we see is, yes, people are now more empathetic and more willing to work with the family or with the child. And it's important to acknowledge our own emotions. We are human beings. We have mental health, we have trauma, right? And things trigger us all the time. So this being reflective is about acknowledging all of that. And if you're going to be doing this work, you have to really acknowledge the whole person, the whole child, and the whole provider, right? Whoever is doing the direct service needs to be honored for them too. So in a professional way, how do we get some of our attitudes, beliefs, our feelings that are normal and happen to all of us, how can we name them and address them so that we can start moving past them? So that's something that our team has been trained in. And it's something that we've tried to practice, especially in the coaching. We talk about it specifically in one of our modules, but really we try to do it in our coaching one-on-one with providers.
Got it.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I think it's one of the biggest takeaways that really everyone on our team has shared is this attention to self-reflection and the reflective process that allows you know, people within the helping profession who just want to continue to give and give, it allows them to really take a moment and value themselves in the work as well. So if I'm taking the time to speak to someone else about it, that must mean that this is really important and that I need to take care of myself in order to give children the best quality of care.
Right. And Kim, maybe you can answer this question. It seems like, at least from what I know of, you know, early childhood mental health consultation models, that there's a very similar dynamic at play of reflective practice. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think while I am not as intimately involved in the daily delivery of our service in the consultation program, so I don't want to overrepresent what goes on, but my understanding is that happens as part of the coaching relationship as well. So it's a real intentional opportunity for that coach to mirror and walk that provider through what they're feeling and processing those emotions, and really put in check those beliefs, those underlying beliefs that we all come to the work with, so that we have a safe space to acknowledge them, name them, and then hold ourselves accountable to moving forward through that, right? And how would we do that in a productive way? So that's my understanding of how it operationalizes in our program.
Right. Yes. And I think that aligns with what I've also heard. And I wanted to uplift that because, again, if we link this back to these policy advocacy opportunities, that there's, again, the foundational trainings and resources, building up your technical knowledge of what is happening with young kids and how to respond. And then there's this other really important piece, which is adults' relationships with each other, and adults' relationships with the child, and adults' relationships with the parents that they're working with. And this work requires a lot of human resources, a lot of everybody's time, and a lot of emotion. And so that honestly is not cheap to deliver. And so what we really want to do with both of these policy advocacy opportunities is let our elected officials know, let the Mental Health Commission know that mental health interventions for young children look, a little different than maybe what older youth and adults need in terms of their mental health support. And so by supporting adults who work with young children, you are intervening, right? That it's not just about, parent-child interaction therapy, where I like to think it was Jessica who said that just because something isn't therapy doesn't mean it's not therapeutic. And I think that's also the message. We want to educate our decision makers and our elected officials about these important needs for young children. And this sort of brings me to one of our other questions, which is that the public school systems, so I'm assuming K to 12, public school systems are gradually reopening, but there is little information that is being published about trauma-informed care strategies for children and teachers re-entering the systems. And so the question here is for the panelists: can you share your thoughts regarding models that are in place to help? And I'll modify that to say, can you share sort of what you think is universally applicable, or at least applicable to older children, based on the work that you're doing with young children?
Go ahead, Kim.
I was going to let you take
No,
it,
you go.
and then. Well, I was just going to share a couple of resources in Orange County that I think, again, I always want to be careful to not like oversell or verify this resource, but our work with all of our public schools and that deep partnership that we've had over 20 years has led them to, many of them have posted resources for how to have conversations with kids about what they're experiencing, so that parents are well equipped to have the conversation with their own child. So I'm not sure that addresses exactly the question that was posed in the chat around models and very formal structures, but really what we're trying to do is create for parents how they can buffer the negative experiences of what we've all been experiencing, and arm them with sort of real life things, conversations starters, questions. So all of these are accessible on our public school districts. Many of them have pivoted and starting posting resources to the families that they would normally be providing in-person services to. They're hosting conversations. I know of a couple of school districts who immediately deployed their counseling services to younger age groups, to creating peer-to-peer led conversations. So I'll stop there, but I know that our public school systems, at least in Orange County, many of them has started to pivot to push out information to help create some resources for parents.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think I'll add, and it kind of goes with Angela, what you were talking about, like this larger approach to being trauma informed. So really, trauma-informed care is an organizational, it's a macro level. If it's done correctly, it's a macro level intervention, which means it should be happening on all levels, right? The direct service level, but also in all the levels, because if we at Drew are not being trauma-informed with our trainers and coaches, how can we expect them to be trauma-informed with the childcare providers who are then expecting to be trauma-informed with the children and parents, right? And that is an organizational commitment. And so what this question kind of highlighted is that there are different, there's a lot of attention being given to mental health now, but there are specific models that do take a more methodical approach where some schools can adopt like a 3-year approach, where the first year, it's the administration, right? Because you need that administrative commitment. And they're getting trained, they're getting coaching, they're devising like, okay, what could the strategic plan be for us implementing it? And in year 2, the faculty gets trained, right? And then there's a deep understanding. And at some point in there, you're also looking at policies and procedures. So I kind of going to your funding ask, right? That takes a lot of time and energy for organizations to look and redo some of their policies, to look at them through a trauma-informed lens and say, you know, we're taking it to the next level. We want to be person-to-person trauma-informed, but we know that we have policies in place that are also re-traumatizing. So those need to get redone, right? And then in year 3, now that at admin, staff, and, you know, we've started to address these policies, we can now train students, families, and then continue this process where you're getting feedback, because it really should be a collaborative process where you're hearing from students, you're hearing from parents, all of the stakeholders.
Right.
So there are models out there that will do that. And then just to give an example of what that could look like in a childcare setting, you know, these expulsions sometimes are not happening just on that level. They're actually, you know, coded into some of the center's ways of operating procedures, right? And so the next level of bridge, again, with like additional funding, right, could be this additional component of, well, now that you're trauma informed and your staffer have this knowledge, what would that look like for your policies and procedures to reflect that? And then really helping, right? They need tools for that. They need support for that, helping them develop some of these best practices, because it is happening. There are, you know, this topic is happening around the country and around the state, but it's happening in such small spaces. And we really want to, like you're saying, Angela, blow it up, right? Like bring it, make it accessible for lots of people and help people implement it and make it accessible. So that was like my double.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. It is 7:31. And so just want to, again, thank you everyone for giving us your evening. We are so appreciative. We will be getting back to you all with our list of resources and everything that we've posted in the chat so that you have everything in one place along with the recording of the webinar. Be sure to follow the Children's Partnership on our social media if you want more opportunities like this. I also just wanted to put in a plug for part 2 of this series. We don't have a date yet, but if you sign up for our newsletter on our website or follow us on Twitter or Instagram, you will hear when we have an announcement for the second webinar. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a good evening.